Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Episode 30, your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and religion, where we will take it all very, very seriously, but not too seriously. Episode 30, Russiagate, all things Russiagate, the bullshit narrative that captured America's imagination for 5 years. Well, capturing America's imagination may be a bit hyperbole. Capturing the media's imagination, well, that's another thing altogether. Making good fodder for cable news networks, that is a certainty. Russiagate being the staple of every 70-year-old's diet, that's no theory, that's law. Our Russiagate coverage will go into detail about how the media has been duped again. In the immortal words of the nightly anchorman on The Simpsons, Kent Brockman, once again, I've been had. We'll examine the ancient, the tried and true, the Western staple that is Russia, the boogeyman from the East. And finally, the paradox that is the Russiagate scandal, where once it was the Republicans using the lure of the Russian boogeyman. Not even a century later, it's your beloved Democrats. But first, a word from our sponsors. Dear listener, I have no sponsors. As I would like to retire and do this full time, this is a problem. Accordingly, reach out to 3,000 or 4,000 of your closest compatriots, colleagues, employees, family members, members of your church, members of other people's churches. Demand they listen to this podcast. In addition, This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast has a Patreon page. Go to that page. Look at its splendor. Click the button that says donate. Take the money that you would tithe to your church, that you would spend on your children's college education, that you might spend frivolously on your mortgage payment, and you give it to this podcast. That is all.
Act 1, it turns out that Russiagate was fake news.
In the mid-'80s, a book called Manufacturing Consent was published, and it had a number of theories surrounding the not only corporatization of the modern media, of the mainstream media, but how the media was so easily influenced by power, by the executive branch of the federal government, by the legislative branch of the federal government, by different bureaucratic agencies, whether it be for national security, whether it be for international security, the military-industrial complex, the Pentagon. The book went into detail about not only how influenced the modern media had become, but it went into detail about the rationales, the corporatization of media at that time, and the limited number of media outlets meant that the media didn't cover a number of controversial issues, namely issues that would be controversial to major corporate interests, but also that the media would take a very non-combative, very monotone, very safe approach to the presentation of the news. The economics make perfect sense. There are a limited number of news outlets. Each of those news outlets is trying to capture as much of the marketplace as possible. While a 21st century news actor, news actress, often masquerading under the title of journalist, while a news actor or news actress will tell you that impartiality is part of the foundation of the industry, the fact is, from the 50s or the 60s on, the public had few choices. You had a limited number of outlets, particularly on television, competing for an entire and national market. Therefore, they wanted to be as palatable to a large swath of consumers, to a diverse array of consumers as possible. What's the easiest way to do that? You stay away from controversial stories, you stay away from controversial issues, and you present them right down the middle, as mainstream as possible. Many consumers, therefore, chose their network by way of the anchor who was actually doing the broadcast, because the news was all the same. You could go to McDonald's, you can go to Burger King, you can go to Wendy's. No matter what you say about each one of those franchises, in reality, it's all repurposed pig slop. It's variety in name only. It's variety in label only. For 50 years, this was an effective news marketing strategy. One of the central stories in Manufacturing Consent, the news issue that the book reflects upon in the coverage provided by the media, is the Vietnam War, and how the American people were ginned up to engage in that conflict, to go to war. The book further discusses the lessons learned, not by the American people, but by the media and by the corporate interests in the media, and most specifically and most importantly, by the government, by government agencies, by government bureaucrats, by government politicians, stakeholders, what have you. The government, throughout the course of the Vietnam War, got much smarter in how it not only operated within the media paradigm, but how it manipulated the media paradigm. 25 years later, a book was published called Lapdogs. Lapdogs is a book that was written about how the media rolled over for the Bush administration in order to promote the Iraq War. The book is frankly damning. It gives example after example about a number of not only media outlets, but so-called alleged journalists, and how they beat the war drum on behalf of the administration. The book is a flat-out indictment of the media, how poorly the media handled what was, at the time, hear me, dear listener, at the time, not in retrospect, but at the time, was quite flimsy, was very poorly documented, and was very poorly presented evidence that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that Saddam Hussein had some sort of affiliation with Al-Qaeda. It was through very minor manipulation that the media bought into this hook, line, and sinker. The media itself threw one of their own under the bus, so to speak, Judith Miller of the New York Times, as the prime mover that led all astray, as the culprit for the media so failing to perform even a rudimentary assessment of the information that was being provided by the White House and, let's not forget, Downing Street, because England, the government in England, was also a very active participant in this falsehood. A book was published this year called Hate Inc. by Matt Taibbi. In this book, Taibbi calls out Russiagate as a falsehood. When I actually did research on the book in anticipation of this piece, although the paperback copy of that book states that it was published in 2021, this book is actually an amalgam of online articles that Taibbi had published in 2018 and 2019. It was in 2019 that the book came out in hardcover, and it was only this year that the book was published in paperback. Although he does not have all the details, Taibbi explains why the Russiagate controversy, if you can call it that, is completely fabricated. The factual, the intellectual, the procedural, the substantive foundation is no different than that which was presented to the American people in order to go to war in Vietnam, in order to go to war in Iraq. The sourcing was no better. The research was no better. The scrutiny was no better. And that's what it really comes down to. Little to no scrutiny on the quote-unquote sources that the media relied upon in order to promote this story. Last week, an attorney that turned out to be one of the primary sources of the Russiagate story was indicted for lying about the Russiagate story. In interviews with the FBI, this attorney, who basically acted as a good Samaritan contemporaneous to this story being released, was in fact being paid by the Clinton campaign during the election in 2016. Like the planted story about the North Vietnamese attacking American warships in the Gulf of Tonkin. Like the planted story about Saddam trying to acquire different types of material to build a nuclear weapon. Like the planted story about Saddam possessing weapons of mass destruction. These plants have a source. There is a person at the bottom of this disgusting spiral that is actually responsible for this material. These are the unnamed sources. When you descend into this lower concentric circle of hell, you find these people and you find the documentation, and it is laughably sparse. It is laughably incomplete. And yet not only is it not scrutinized by the media, it is accepted hook, line, and sinker, and it is promoted to the American public. This is Politics 101. I will give the Clintons credit where credit is due. They know how to run political campaigns. I've said it in prior podcasts. If Hillary had actually listened to Bill and had followed his advice, she would have beat Trump. This is a brilliant piece of political assassination. And if Hillary had actually gone out and campaigned in the places where Bill had recommended she campaign, instead of relying on this 21st century data metric bullshit, Trump would have been just another footnote in history. And you'd probably be in your second term of President Clinton. But because Hillary Clinton fumbled the ball on the 1 yard line, not only did Trump win the election, but now you have the paradigm where we have to perpetuate this story in order to delegitimize his victory and his presidency. And the media was all the willing to do it. So where you would expect media scrutiny on a story like this, you had none. In fact, the media embraced the story because it fit a narrative that they were looking for. Trump is the bad guy that we expect him to be. Trump is the bad guy that we all believe him to be. What's more, this fits into the narrative that was explained in manufacturing consent. Let's not address any of the main issues facing the American people, the nation, the different states, the different communities. Let's not address any of the pertinent or substantive issues. This narrative feeds nicely into corporate media. These media interests are owned by major corporations. Most of those corporations not only have other business interests, but they have extremely close ties to the corporations that advertise on their networks. So while you see vitriol and you see what you believe to be hard-hitting investigative journalism into a story like this, the story in and of itself is bullshit, and it is just fodder for one side or another to fill up airtime, to provide something for eyeballs so that you will continue to come back. You will continue to stay tuned to the television set. You will be present for the advertising, and they also can avoid all of the substantive issues that would actually affect your day-to-day life. If you take a step back from it, it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. They get you so distracted with fear and anger and hate that they can completely avoid any issue that you would actually need information about, that you would need education about. It's how they've gotten us into 2 wars based on, for all intents and purposes, bullshit. And it's how they've generated millions and millions of dollars over the course of the last 5 or 6 years. Many people thought that cable news and news in general, particularly broadcast news, was under threat by way of what? Social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. But cable news fought back. This is cable news in the 21st century. They may not be able to get you to click, but they can get you to come back again and again and again selling this bullshit narrative. Whether it's CNN or MSNBC selling you Russiagate, or whether it's Fox News selling you on the illegitimacy of Russiagate, you keep coming back. The empire strikes back. This type of kabuki theater, this type of show trial, has very strong roots in modern American history, specifically over the baby boomer. Now, the baby boomer will, over and over again, lament about when America was great. Let's talk about a time when they believed America was great, the 1950s. Younger people, millennials, Gen Z, there is a lot more information on social media about the things that were going on in the 1950s that were not a part of the media, that were not a part of the lexicon, that were not a part of particularly popular culture, that don't really paint a picture of America being so great in the 1950s. If you think Russiagate made for great television, hearken back to the early 1950s and the McCarthy trials investigating communism in all elements, in all segments of American life. In the late 40s, and I believe it actually really started in 1950, a man named Joseph McCarthy had trials in the Senate to investigate out and condemn communists within the ranks of labor, communists within the ranks of Hollywood and entertainment, communists within the ranks of the bureaucracy of Washington, D.C., or communists within the ranks of the bureaucracy of state governments. These were, plain and simple, show trials. The evidence against most of these so-called communists was scant. But as the fervor for these trials grew, you saw fewer and fewer people come out publicly and call this for the bullshit that it was. Those people that stood up and called bullshit were very often ruined not only within their industry, but their public image. Many of them were still being accused of being communist 2 decades later. Do you know the one entity that provided zero resistance to what amounted to nothing more than a witch hunt? That's right, dear listener. That's right. Your beloved, your sacrosanct, your impeachable American media. These trials made for great television. These trials made for great print. And so the media followed along. When the fervor died down, when the truth of the trials came out, when Joseph McCarthy himself was ruined, who was there in the post-mortem to express their disdain, to express how disappointed they were, to condemn those that had participated, not including themselves, of course, but to condemn those that had perpetuated these show trials? That's right, your American media. They are the outlet by which we can knock someone off, right? The king of the hill analogy, that we can knock someone down who's high and mighty, and then they feel they are the outlet, that they are the standard for then the regret or the remorse or for the condemnation that needs to be administered or dealt out to those that they believe, that the media believes were actually responsible for what happened, thereby making themselves somewhat of a third party, abrogating their own responsibility for perpetuating the witch hunt, for perpetuating the downfall. As I've said in prior podcasts, as much as this may sound like a condemnation of the media, I think it is just as much, if not more, a condemnation of us, of consumers of media product. We want to see the show trial, and then when we see the consequences of the show trial, we want to be able to point the finger and say, there's the guilty party. They're the people that actually did that, not us. The media is a perfect outlet for this. But, as I've said in prior podcasts, I think that there is an evolution coming to the media, and I believe that it is a net positive, not a net negative. This whole posture by the mainstream media about how it's being attacked and its place in American life is now being challenged, this has all been brought on by the media themselves. And it is the extent to which we will continue to watch that we will continue to click on what is nothing more than clickbait that will perpetuate this nonsense. More and more Americans are turning away from it. Now, as I've said in prior podcasts, I think, unfortunately, many Americans are turning to even more dubious sources, but I think that's part of the growing pain of what we're doing now as a population, as a public. We're coming to the realization that there was no high watermark for the media in the United States. It's very likely gone through ebbs and flows for most of the nation's history. And although there may have been moments, there may have been these limited times where there was a high watermark for the media, more often than not, they failed us. As a public, they failed us. So what's the solution? Where is the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow? I think it's out there on social media in independent journalism. From the Iraq War to the Harvey Weinstein matter, there are countless stories where members of the media have said, my producers, my editors, the owners of this company, the owners of this massive corporation killed this story. And even if they were inclined to do so, at the time, they really didn't have a forum that they could go to and publish that story. Now they do. And you are seeing more and more journalists publish more and more journalism, stories that they've actually researched on issues that are not part of the public lexicon on particularly cable news or mainstream news. This is market economics at work in the mainstream media. The traditional outlets are being exposed for what they have probably been for not decades, but maybe even hundreds of years. Corporate shills that often worked more in service of power for the sake of the almighty dollar than they ever did as the fourth estate representing the people. Now, anyone who is truly concerned with journalism, who truly wants to be a journalist, can go out and actually publish stories without the permission of their corporate overlord. Well, of course, without the permission of their old corporate overlord. Now they just need to get the permission of their new corporate overlord, that being, of course, Facebook, that being, of course, Twitter, that being, of course, YouTube. No happy ending here on this segment, dear listener. Nothing is ever perfect.
Act 2, the Russian boogeyman.
Clinton and the Democrats know how to pick their targets well. Part of the human condition is to suffer from recency bias. Whatever has happened recently is, of course, the most significant thing that's ever happened in the course of human history, and it's never, ever, ever happened like this before. A quick turn of pages of even the most rudimentary, even the most bland history book disproves this notion in short order. Russia has been a foil for the West for hundreds, yes, hundreds of years. Western nations, France, Britain, Spain, Holland, Belgium, they have always seen Russia as a threat, and for very good reason. Large country, lots of people, plenty of resources. How would global politics, how would the geopolitical power struggle shift if a country like Russia actually came about as a first world superpower, or at least a competitor for being a first world superpower? So Western nations have always done their best to keep Mother Russia down.
Russians should have known. Anti-Semite, slippery Cossack sluts.
That's right, there's been no historical love lost between the East and West, between Western powers and Russia. And there's been no lack of effort. There have been no lengths Western powers would not go to make sure Russia stayed in her place. A great example of this is the Crimean War. Are we going to talk about history again? Yes, we're going to talk about history again. The Crimean War, a war that took place before the U.S. Civil War. You look at a lot of the sanitized history about the precursors for this war, and it's all founded, it's all rooted in religion. But with the fall of the Soviet Union, with the proliferation of documents that are now available to us, internet sleuths and historians alike, the real causes of that war are clear. And it demonstrates the Achilles heel that Russia has had from a geographic standpoint since its inception. Since we could call Russia, Russia. As large a country as it is, as much land mass as it occupies, it does not have easy access to a warm weather seaport, to a seaport that doesn't freeze over for half the year. Over the course of decades, over the course of centuries, Western powers have always been able to keep Russia down by blocking its access to a warm weather seaport. It's no more complicated than this, dear listener, and think about it in the perspective of what you know. You don't even have to be a historian. Holland, the Netherlands, these were extremely wealthy nations given their navy and their ability to go out and exploit the new world, the undiscovered world, Africa, South America, North America. I'm not asking you to be a pseudo-Magellan here. By way of even your vague memory of these countries and where they are on a map, they're not big. Even if they had for them what is a large army, even if they had for them what is a large navy, it's not but so big. So how is it that countries like that could amass such wealth where Russia could not? When it comes to what I think we can all agree upon now was the exploitation of the New World. Russia just had a problem getting there. Russia never had a large and powerful navy because of its geographic restrictions. And when Russia wanted to grow up, when Russia wanted to develop a large and powerful navy, it still had the limitation. Several times over the centuries, it still had the limitation of being bound to cold water ports, ports that would freeze over. So those ships could only leave those ports for a limited time over the course of each year. Western powers, and let's be clear, cleverly so, from a neutral standpoint, just looking at whether or not you would allow another power to grow up, to exercise its potential to compete with you, you just keep that little, but growing, that little brother at bay by blocking their access to a warm weather port. Russia wanted to expand its boundaries in 1853, and it used its own religious, its own geopolitical bullshit arguments in light of the Western powers' religious and geopolitical bullshit arguments to enter into and to occupy the Crimea. Russia quickly found itself in a conflict with a number of Western powers, namely France, namely the United Kingdom, but also the Ottoman Empire and Sardinia, basically Turkey. No, I'm not going to challenge you to go look at a map, but the Crimea isn't that far away from one Ottoman Empire, from Turkey. Western powers, Turkey itself, has always seen Russia's encroachment on the Crimea in the Black Sea as a precursor for what? To come further south, to get closer and closer to the borders of Turkey, to then give Russia access to a warm water port. I know what you're saying now, dear listener. Why the hell are we going over this? I'm bored. I'm about to turn this podcast off. Fine, I'll get to the point. The point is, you aren't going to be able to rally the people to go and fight a war over whether or not Nation A or Nation B has access to a warm water port. Throughout the course of history, hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, you need to be able to gin up support from people to go and fight a war, and you need the media to do this. And you need a rationale to give to the media why person, why regime, why country X is the bad guy. Those that control the levers of power may see, may understand the geopolitical chessboard for what it is, but they sure as hell aren't going to try to use that rationale to explain to Joe Q public why they need to get in a boat and sail halfway across the world to go kill somebody. The narrative isn't complicated. It's pretty much a white hat, black hat situation. In the Russiagate matter, Oh, those pesky Russians want Trump to be president because they can manipulate him. Sounds pretty good. Just for your curiosity, and I know you're probably not curious about it at all, but I did bring up the Crimean War for a reason. Yes, Russia has been a common foil, and in that situation, the Western powers used, of course, religion. Religion. Folks, sign your children up. We need to put them in a boat. We need to sail them halfway across the world to go out and kill for Jesus. Yes. This tried and true motivational tactic reminds me of one of my favorite Simpsons episodes, where Bart goes to work at a bordello. In the universe of the show, the puritanical characters all band together to confront Homer and demand he answer for why his son works at a bordello.
Oh, this isn't going to be about Jesus, is it?
All things are about Jesus, Homer. Except this.
No truer words have ever been spoken. All things are about Jesus, except for this. In 1853, it was all about how their bad Jesus worship was not to be tolerated, and therefore we had to go halfway across the world to prevent them from occupying the Crimea. In 2016, it's the dupe Donald Trump being a Russian agent without knowing it, or maybe consciously knowing it. But we can't let them pesky Ruskies threaten our way of life. And people in the West, including the United States, up and into today, have used harboring resentments against Russia for their own political and financial gain. But as a number of true journalists have pointed out, Russia isn't nearly the boogeyman that the Clintons or the Democrats or any of these intelligence agencies would make them out to be. Is Russia a cyber threat? Do they have these cyber capabilities? Yes, of course they do. Of course they do. Is that a threat to all nations? Not just those in the West, but to all nations? Of course they are. Of course they are. Are they any more of a threat than North Korea or Iran? Not really. I can go through and pull off of the Google machine a number of stories about how agents in both North Korea and Iran have used cyber technologies to breach a number of firewalls for companies, individuals, governments in the West. No, they point that finger at Russia. To be clear, dear listener, I am not defending Vladimir Putin. I am not defending the government in Russia. What I'd like you to see is the paradox. It's the same paradox that we had in Libya. It's the same paradox that we had in Iraq. We've had this in a number of countries. The U.S., for domestic purposes, makes autocrats in other countries out to be much more powerful and much more capable than they actually are. Those domestic purposes are then rolled out in foreign policy and often to the long-term detriment of not only U.S. interests, but worldwide interests. Gaddafi was a paper tiger. Who toppled him? One Hillary Clinton, making him out to be some sort of maniacal genius. Saddam had those WMDs. Saddam was trying to build a nuclear weapon. You realize, dear listener, that both of these leaders used that hyperbole that was going on in a domestic capacity. It wasn't a worldwide phenomenon. It was being batted around in the media domestically in the United States and maybe in England. These autocrats, Gaddafi, Hussein, used this as leverage against their enemies in their own countries to say, you should be afraid of me. Look what I'm capable of. Look what I have. Look at the implements of destruction at my disposal. Who are you to question whether or not it's true? It is appearing daily in the U.S. media. This dawned on me based on criticism and then subsequent interviews from a guy named Artemi Panarin. He is a hockey player in the United States. He's played for the Blackhawks. He's played for the Blue Jackets. A couple of years ago, he signed a pretty lucrative contract with the New York Rangers. Panarin hasn't just been critical of Putin. He has been critical with specificity. He has described why Putin as an autocrat has brought down the country of his birth, dear Mother Russia. And those specifics are very important. Panarin did not mean this in a demeaning or in an insulting way. But as a Columbus Blue Jacket, he comes out and says, look at Columbus as a city. Look at it compared to other American cities. It is not in the top 10 of American cities, and yet it is nice. It is clean. It is a safe place to live. Why? Because the government officials in Columbus get to collect taxes, and the tax money stays in Columbus. The government officials in the state of Ohio get to collect taxes in the state of Ohio, and the money stays in the state of Ohio. What happens in Russia, you may ask? Well, Panarin explains. In Russia, all of the cities collect their tax money. All of the municipalities, all of the regions, all of that money goes to Moscow. Moscow then decides how money is going to be redistributed. This autocratic approach to things as simple as tax collection and then the distribution of tax monies for municipal services. It's why the roads in Russia are a 20th and 21st century version of the road warrior. There's absolutely no law. There are no rules. Everybody in Russia has a camera in their car because people will just run right into you. People will just cut you off. It is completely lawless because there is no enforcement of any rule on the road. In addition, in many areas, the roads are trash. If you're making a claim to your insurer, you often need to document the state of the road that you were driving on so they don't think you're trying to pull off insurance fraud. What is the point I'm making to you? What is the point that many journalists are now pointing out? Russia, for all intents and purposes, under Vladimir Putin, is holding itself back. Like any other autocratic state where the autocrat is clinging to power. That is not a finely oiled machine. That is not such a worthy adversary that we should have media coverage, that we should have airtime dedicated to it, to Russia, to Putin, day in and day out. But give it up to the Clintons. Give it up to the Democratic Party. Give it up to MSNBC in particular. Blaming Putin, blaming the Russians, Russiagate. It plays to century-old fears that we have in the West about that country.
Act 3: The paradox is too rich to ignore.
Most powerful, wealthy people have, at some point in their lives, at some point in their professional careers, or even in their upbringing, a mentor. No one is born wise. No one just simply has knowledge and then can put it into practice in a very practical, in a very efficient, in a very measured way. Many powerful people had powerful mentors. One such relationship is between Donald J. Trump and Roy Cohn. I think you all know who Donald J. Trump is, but do you know who Roy Cohn is? Harken back to Act 1, the first segment of this very podcast, and the show trials of one Joseph McCarthy. No man is an island. No one could put together the cases that McCarthy had put together by himself. McCarthy had a team of young, enterprising lawyers who would thoroughly go through the lives of the people who were being investigated, and with very scant evidence and by manipulating the media and the documents and anything that they could get their hands on, ruined people's lives. McCarthy himself was a genius. He was a mentor to these young lawyers. Who were these young lawyers, you may ask? One of their names was Robert Kennedy. What, you might ask? Liberal icon Robert Kennedy? Savior to the poor, the uneducated, the huddled masses? One and the same, dear listener. One and the same. Bobby learned D.C., Bobby learned bureaucracy, Bobby learned how to destroy his fellow man at the feet of one Joseph McCarthy. This is how Bobby learned how to destroy political rivals. This is where Bobby learned how to pull the levers of power. And this is where Bobby learned how to manipulate the media. Well, you might ask, dear listener, who else was on this legal staff? A man named Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn, for his part, would go on to be a very high-profile and iconic, I think you could say, lawyer in New York City. And it was Roy Cohn that took one young Donald J. Trump under his wing in the 1980s. I've always thought it hilarious how so many people try to pin on Donald J. Trump this rap that he doesn't pay his debts. This is a strategy, dear listener, and it is a strategy that was taught to the Donald by Roy Cohn. Not only was Roy Cohn a very strategic thinker, but he knew the ins and outs of the law. He knew the ins and outs of how you could actually accumulate information that could be used against other people. And he knew how, specifically, to manipulate the media. In real estate development, you are going to be dealing with contractors. Contractors are often working by the skin of their teeth. Their budgets are extremely tight. You want to renegotiate a contract with a contractor, whether or not the work is good, whether or not the work was timely, you just don't pay that contractor. Generally, not only does that contractor need the money to pay his subs, generally, not only does that contractor need the money to actually observe, actually recognize, actually realize a profit, but then that contractor needs to take some of that money and invest it in the other jobs that that contractor has going on in order to keep the machine running, in order to keep the wheels spinning. Cohn astutely, adeptly educated Trump that, hey, don't pay them. They need that money. These contractors might accept 70 cents on the dollar. They might accept 60 cents on the dollar. Hell, some of them might even accept 50 cents on the dollar. Even if they accept 80 cents on the dollar, you've still realized a profit. So Trump was getting sued left and right. And you'd think, oh, wow, wouldn't that impair his image? Wouldn't that sully his image within the media? It's New York City. To the extent that anyone was going to pay attention to these lawsuits, it was easy. The response was so simple. These guys are deadbeats. They didn't do the work that they said that they were going to do. They're trying to screw me. Now, in a lot of places, that's going to resonate with a number of people. Plenty of us have actually had a contractor come out to our house, say they were going to do some work. We probably gave them too much money or all of the money to perform that work, and they either A, did a terrible job, or B, never showed up and did it at all. When you have money, as Roy Cohn educated a young Donald Trump, you can renegotiate any contract that you ever want. You breach, you go into litigation, it's a renegotiation process. Frequently, the other party won't even take you into litigation because the cost of doing so are so high, are so steep, they can't even afford it. And if you get someone who's bold enough to think that they can, you draw it out as long as you can so that person, that entity, is bleeding money. No one gets up on a Monday morning and says, you know, I don't have enough hobbies. I don't have enough specialized interests. I have too much free time. You know what I want to do? Besides being a spouse, being a parent, being a member of the community, having a job, having an occupation, having a profession, I want to take on a lawsuit. I want to get up every morning out of my bed and I want to lay my head down on the pillow at night, having this lawsuit looming over me. As bold as people talk about who they are and what they're made of, you want to see them crumble? Put them into a lawsuit. Have that lawsuit drag out for years. Trump, for his part, not only had the money, he had the backbone, he had the stomach. And he had an extremely savvy mentor in order to help him spin the yarn if the media ever came a-calling, so that he would never look like the bad guy. But in a paradox, that's just too rich and thick and savory and delicious to ignore. A man whose mentor pioneered such tactics. Donald J. Trump is now being attacked using those very same tactics. Cohn destroyed lives by calling people communists. And if they couldn't get the commie label pinned to them, communist sympathizers. Traitors. The man was good at it. Fast forward 70 years later, and although he's now dead, the tactics that he pioneered are alive and well in the mainstream media, are alive and well with the Democratic Party, and are alive and well with one Hillary Clinton. Well, wait, you might ask, don't you see that there's a paradox within the paradox? Yes, dear listener, I do see that there's a paradox within the paradox. 70 years ago, you had a maniacal, fame-hungry, camera-starved, social-climbing senator from the state of Wisconsin using the scare of communism to attack what he thought were leftist pinkos, the unions, the entertainment business, bureaucrats in Washington, and who, in the revisionist history of the 21st century, stood up to such tyranny. It was the Democrats. It was your beloved media. Of course, in an autopsy of those trials, there were very few people who were actually standing up to what McCarthy was doing. And yes, they were Democrats, but there were very few of them. And they weren't members of the media, that's for sure. But not 70 years later, who is employing the tactics of one Joseph McCarthy to paint someone as a commie, as a sellout, as a traitor, as a pinko? Why, it's one Hillary Clinton. Why, it's the Democratic Party themselves. And who is standing up to as much? It's the Republicans. Dear listener, it's why I say time and again, don't give power, don't give authority, don't open up Pandora's box, because you have no idea how in the future things are going to play out. How power struggles will make strange bedfellows of politics, policy, religion, social issues. You don't sacrifice personal freedom because you believe in that moment that it's going to be in the best interests of your community, of your city, of your state, of your country. We can't see all ends. We don't know all of the different factors that would play into the sacrificing of our freedoms. But you already know how I feel about that. One thing that does not change, one area where there's no true paradox, well, that's with your beloved media. It's represented by clicks. In the 21st century, it was probably represented by flash bulbs in the 20th century. You've heard the sound, those one-time use flash bulbs going off over and over and over again. But the foundation is the same. The effect is the same. This is the media chasing after your attention. This is the media trying to get your eyeballs glued, fixated on content. Don't worry. If they think it profitable enough, and when the dust settles, they'll be there to wag their finger as if they represent our collective consciousness in the post-mortem of Russiagate, in the aftermath of Russiagate. Will you be listening to that, dear listener? This is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast.